everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here with Bria Tavakoli. Did I say it right?
You sure did.
Outstanding. Well, I should get it right at this point in the game. How are you today?
I'm good. Sometimes I don't get it right myself, to be quite honest. But yes, I'm great. So good to be here with you. I feel like this has been years in the making. I'm beyond happy to be here.
Let's talk about that. So I don't even know how we got in touch with you, but we had you helping on a bunch of editorial stuff years ago, and you had some experience at Yoga Journal and some other magazines, and it was really cool to be able to work with you like that. And I don't even remember when that was. Was that deep COVID?
Yeah, I think it was sometime in 2021, and I initially had somehow gotten onto one of your. We connected somehow around your courses, and then we started talking about other stuff, and it turned out that it was like, oh yeah, this is a way that we can collaborate, and that was super fun. I love it when I get to use my different skills in different contexts, so that was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are here today to talk about, I guess, are you a sex therapist, relationship therapist, LMFT? Like, what's your background right now?
Okay. So currently I am a licensed professional counselor candidate in the state of Colorado. So effectively I am a therapist under supervision while I complete licensure hours. And I do focus on relational and sex therapy. And as you can imagine, a lot of those things are very interwoven. And another piece of the puzzle for me is that I have a professional and personal fascination with the intersection of sex and relational therapy and psychedelic work.
Yeah, dope. All right. So let's rewind the tape even further now that we set the stage there. And yeah, like how did this psychedelic topic come up for you? How did you become aware of it? Was it like through the yoga world's kind of intersection with ayahuasca, or was it something different?
It actually wasn't. It's something that I had been hearing about for several years, probably around the same time that How You Change Your Mind had started to really become a part of the collective dialogue. And I feel like these things come to us when they're meant to. And I think that I was at the point on my personal healing journey that I was meant to start hearing about this. And so I was hearing about it for several years. And I had this sense that I feel like this is going to be a part of my path, but not yet. And then and it actually wasn't through the yoga world, which is interesting, but the yoga teaching and meditation teaching experience, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, was absolutely a key part of this and continues to be a key part of this for now. So yeah, I heard about it, thought about it, read up on it, talked to some people about it for a few years, just kind of like exploring a little bit. And then eventually I started to become friends with some people who were deep in this work themselves. And I was invited to some ceremonies. I declined a couple times because my system just knew it wasn't quite the right time. Like I think one of the first ones I was ever invited to was an ayahuasca ceremony on Halloween. And I'm like, ooh, I think the bills might be a little too thin. That might be too deep of a dive for me at this stage in my journey. But a few months later, I felt truly ready. And so I went in and started doing the work, and it made a huge difference for me. It moved the needle for me in ways that my background with all the therapy I've done and in personal work I've done personally set the stage, but it really just was like a power tool. It just really moved the needle around a lot of long-standing, deeply held trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is while you were living in New York, right?
This was initially it started in New York. The call started in New York, but I didn't answer it while I was there. And then when I got an opportunity to come to Colorado right before the pandemic, I got to move to Colorado. And then that's when it started to really feel like emergent, like this is about to become a reality in my life. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Great. Also, if you need me to redo any parts of this.
You're all good. Okay. So you have a unique accent. Where were you from originally?
I grew up in Texas.
Okay.
I spent a big chunk of my adult life in New York City, and I still have, I would say, a decent part of my life is New York based
Right on.
in a sense. And then, but the other part of my upbringing that's really interesting is that my dad immigrated from Iran. So I have that background, that additional like cultural piece that definitely adds to the intrigue and the just like it adds a lot of it adds some really interesting layers, I would say.
Have you seen the brand that's making some interesting product called Ancestral Magi?
I don't think so. What is that?
So they make like all sorts of stuff that they allege was potentially traditionally used in Iran,
Oh,
like a
really?
lot of like Syrian rue, Harmala related product.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, and things around lucid dreaming, potentially like psychedelic boosts. Like it's an interesting group. I have never tried their product. I'm hoping to have some of them on the show sometime soon because like the Persian kind of like psychedelic history is very interesting to me.
Yeah, there is something there. I'll look into that more. That sounds fascinating.
Right. And
Yeah.
to speak to Iran, like potentially one of the like it could have been one of the most amazing countries in the world if it didn't go in like a wonky direction, right? It's so
Yeah, I
pretty, like barely not Paris, right?
right. It makes me feel I really appreciate you recognizing that because I feel like a lot of things a lot of ancient Persia contributions to the culture get really sort of attributed to other cultures or
Right. Like
not.
the Renaissance in Europe would not have happened without Middle Eastern culture preserving the stuff from the ancient Mediterranean world. And
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all very true.
yeah, so yeah, like algebra, all of it. Yeah.
I
Like
know
one of my
algebra.
favorite things I studied in my undergrad was Middle Eastern, or sorry, not Middle Eastern, medieval philosophy, and we touched on all sorts of really interesting Arab philosophers, and it was like, oh, nobody really talks about this.
It's true, and while I can do without the algebra, I think that the ancient Persians, even maybe not so ancient, were very focused around the healing power of pleasure and music, eroticism, poetry, like
Let's talk
food.
about that. Let's talk about the pleasure and music.
Mm.
So like what do you like Kama Sutra from what I understand is from India, but was there like a analogous tradition or something in the
Oh
Middle East?
man, that's actually a really good question that I actually don't know the answer to. It wouldn't surprise me if there were though. Yeah, I feel
I
like
love that.
I knew this conversation with you was going to bring more questions for me than that I can start looking into
It's my
myself.
every single day for me. So all good and welcome to the party. But yeah, it's like I think like there is a unique like refined decadence is
Hmm.
like kind of how I perceive it as an outsider non-scholar.
Right.
Like it wasn't like Caligula, right? Which is just like
Mm-mm.
absolutely unchained. Um,
Right. Yeah.
right,
Yeah. And I mean, and I feel like for me personally, like in this work, a lot of what I'm doing is actually in some ways reclaiming my personal ancestry in both sides of my family. Because my mother reportedly, we haven't done the DNA, was part Native American, you know? And then what you're saying about that ancient culture, yeah, those rites of passage, those rituals. And I feel like a lot of that has been, for any number of reasons, kind of stripped away or muted, silenced over the years. And it feels like a lot of this work for me personally is returning to myself and not just to me. Like I feel like it's, and I'm sure a lot of listeners resonate with this, is that it's also we're healing potentially our own ancestry, generations
right,
past and potentially generations future can benefit from our healing.
right. And we don't have to even get like even remotely woo. Like we know that we transmit epigenetic stuff
Exactly.
to descendants. And we know that our behavior impacts how other people can live their lives. So
It
there's a lot
certainly
there.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and
And
it's some I do talk about this sometimes with clients. I'm like, I almost feel like this couple things that you really seem to struggle with, I'm not 100% sure how much of it is actually yours. Like, I wonder if there's potentially an epigenetic component in certain scenarios. I think there is actually.
we have some fun stuff like that around in holotropic breath work. We, our assumption and how we help people figure stuff out is like, it's a little more Occam's razory. It's like we don't have to go transpersonal until like nothing else makes sense. And even then, it's all wildly speculative, and it's just what's helpful for the individual. And but to your point here, it's like people want to do what's best for their children, and like if they aren't cleaning up their psyche, like they could be potentially transmitting stuff unknowingly to the next generations, and like particularly as we're talking about like relationships and sex, around sex and relationships in a very big way.
And there's something that kind of goes into the yogic thing as well, as they say that the state of mind, the emotional and mental and spiritual state of the parents upon conception can have an impact on that child on
Mm,
throughout their life, actually. So that's an
that's
Ayurvedic
interesting.
perspective. And it's kind of points to what you're talking about that modern science is starting to track.
That's fascinating. So
Hmm.
let's talk about like where you're being a specialist now, and it's this like relationship, sex, psychedelics thing. Like, was there at first, like, what was your first inkling that these things could be put together in some way?
Yeah, and in all honesty, like the old saying that research is me search, and I was doing some personal research. And I had some experiences with some various psychedelics and some experiences about how, in some cases, kind of like feels like dumb luck, but now I realize maybe it was like some sort of destiny that they really just helped my heart and my body to like release certain things and to open and be more have that more of that capacity for love was present. And so through those experiences, I had some personal experiences and they showed me that there is a connection between the erotic and divine, and these experiences were both on my own and in more of a relational context. And I was like, wow, there's really something here. And not that many people are talking about it. And I wonder why that is. And I wish somebody would talk about this. And as time went on, I started to realize, okay, there's a few people who are in these waters and talking about it openly. And I was like, a big part of my own life is to become who I needed when I was younger. And so I was like, I think this is part of what I need to do. I actually need to become that person that a younger version of myself needed, around redefining and reclaiming my relationship with my own sexuality. And by doing that, by doing my own work, and then doing formal clinical studies and clinical hours and being under supervision and doing additional trainings in sex therapy and relational modalities, I can then have a really strong foundation where I can work with people in that space.
Mm,
So that's kind of how it all started.
that's interesting. So like in when I was studying, one of my mentors at one point said like we don't really get into sexuality here. It's just far too complicated. And like, engaging in like, sexual, abnormalities or like bad relationships to your own, sexuality. And like, it's just to a degree, it is wildly complicated. I was asking some friends the other day, clinician friends, I was like, what? Like we have a pretty good handle on how to do therapy, but like, our model for the psyche, generally speaking, is we don't really have any agreements there. Like around sexuality, I'm sure there's a lot of similar kind of challenges around like, do we have any kind of real consensus around like what are we talking about here, and like what are the real problems? And I think my question was like, do we have a relatively mature understanding of human sexuality at this point, or do we have like a a relatively immature look at it that we can help people, but like there's still a lot of questions we need to ask.
Right. And I just want to say that the very thing that makes some people shy away is the thing that makes me personally and professionally want to lean in is the fact that it is complicated and multifaceted. Like, I am sure that until the day I no longer exist on this physical plane, I will continue to learn in this space. And that is a wildly hopeful space, an optimistic space for me personally. I know some people have a different take on that. They're like, oh my God, I'm so intimidated. But for me, that's fascinating. It's like I never get bored. Somebody asked me one time, how is it that you never get bored? I was like, well, they were like, what are you even doing? I was like, I'm paying attention to my breath right now. And they just like looked at me and I was like, and this is why I never get bored. Because there's like, life is endlessly fascinating for me in a lot of ways. That's how I see it. So the very thing that causes some people to lean away, and that's okay, that's where they're at, it's actually what causes me to lean in. I think, to your point, we have some pretty good understanding about sex and sexuality. There's so much more that still needs to be done. We live in a more pathology-based mindset around it a lot of times. For example, there's a lot of people coming to me as clients self-labeling themselves as quote unquote sex addicts, right? That's actually not a diagnosis in the DSM. Now,
is that like a humble brag or
no?
Kidding,
The folks who come to me
I know
are
some people with real problems. Yeah,
significant
obviously.
distress.
Yeah.
And wow, there's so many different directions I could go here. So while that's not a specific diagnosis in the DSM, I'm also not a person who's like, oh, yay, DSM all day, every day. It's a tool and it has its limits. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of obsession in the field around performance and or pathologizing of sexuality. What I'm really hoping to see more of as things continue to evolve is a more holistic wellness-based model of sex and sexuality, because I do believe that erotic energy can be an incredibly healing force. I mean, it is life force. Anybody who has a child is probably familiar with the fact that, wow, this literally creates life. And even if we're not using erotic energy to create actual children, we can use erotic energy in a creative way.
Three people I want to ask you about if you've kind of like bumped into them as part of your training at all in sex therapy, and three names. You got Wilhelm Reich, Otto Rank, and Christopher Hyatt.
Definitely Reich. The other two, not so much. The names do sound familiar, to be quite honest, but I'm not 100% sure. There are also a lot of names from grad school, I'll be quite honest, that
Totally.
I don't fully remember, though the concepts, I'm like, oh yeah, that thing. So.
Yeah, I think like Hyatt was pretty involved in like kind of contemporary psychodynamic stuff, like bioenergetic-y things, just like post-Reichian. And then there was Otto Rank was kind of like from what I recall, early European psychoanalyst who did a lot of stuff around birth trauma. So like informing Groff's kind of like BPM stuff. And then, so just kind of be curious.
I've got it right here. I'm writing down stuff as we're talking because I know every time I talk to you, there's always like so much like rich fodder for continuing ed.
Tragically, yeah.
Tragically.
Part of the problem is it makes life too short. You're like, oh man, I don't have enough time. I thought I did. No, definitely don't. So,
I agree.
Now, were there any kind of like cornerstone theories that like really helped you understand and inform your perspective on sex therapy as a practice?
I would say one of the main things that underpins all of my work, whether it's focused around sex or not, is Jungian work. So one of the biggest, and I'm going to try to quote this, I'm probably not going to get this right word for word, but one of the biggest themes in my work is his quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will drive your life and you will call it fate." And so when we're working with sex and sexuality, it actually feels almost like a cheat code in therapy. Because if somebody comes to me with a sexual concern, they're usually fairly motivated. And what is or isn't happening in the sexual space, it's like a portal to the rest of that person's psyche.
I love
So
that.
somebody comes to me and thinks that they have, for example, self-diagnosed erectile dysfunction. And sometimes there might be a physical issue. We always want to screen and refer and make sure that they're also being looked at on the physical level, of course. But there also might be, for example, deep-seated anxiety, fear of abandonment and rejection. And so their body is not allowing certain things to happen, not allowing them to get too close or too vulnerable in a certain way. Like I'm thinking of a few clients over time, and I said that it sounds like perhaps your body is not, quote unquote, functioning and performing sexually the way you would like it to, in part because your body is actually trying to protect your heart. And you maybe feel that this person who you're with, for some reason, you don't feel quite safe with this person yet or at all. And so that sort of dialogue, really, we can start to do a really deep dive into the psyche if they are consenting to go along for that.
It's really fascinating. There's so much like shame and secrecy around sexuality, and I wonder about that as like that's the reason it's so heavy, is because of the shame and secrecy. And I remember, this is pretty far out, but Wilhelm Reich had all sorts of interesting things he was proposing that could, like, solve this ahead of time, right? Like, what if we were able to do culture differently in a way that didn't leave people like sexually traumatized and
What if,
therefore bioenergetically traumatized and stunted?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're 1,000% right. The shame, the secrecy, the cultural narratives, the ideas that people get about what sex is supposed to look and feel like that are based on pornography, which pornography is fantasy, it's performance. But for a lot of folks, that's their sex education, because we're lacking in that for the most part in this country and in this culture. So we absorb these ideas, and then the shame piece is huge. It's absolutely huge.
Right.
And I think sort of it's easier to feel shame sometimes than to really face up to our own, the power that we carry inside of us.
I love that. So the way you're talking about sex therapy, like, it feels somewhat relevant to psychedelic therapy and potentially how people like unfold on their own with psychedelics outside of a therapeutic context sometimes.
Yes,
and
sometimes.
and notice we didn't quantify that, everybody. But yeah, it's interesting that, like, there is some sort of like seeming analogy here, and makes me wonder, okay, like, how do we put these things together? Like, the closest thing I know about is, like, okay, a spouse goes through psychedelic therapy, has a great turnaround. 6 months later, divorce, because that person changed too much and the other person didn't change at all necessarily. But when both spouses are in therapy, or PAT, like, the split up rate's a bunch lower. Like, if both partners are trying to grow on their own, but like in tandem with their partner, like, there's something really special there. Where if one's only doing the work, like, it's hard to even be recognized. Like, I know some people who have had really hard times going back to their spouses after being participants.
Yeah, because psychedelics show us things that we can't unsee. or we can try to unsee and bury some of what we see there, but for the most part, once the light has illuminated certain parts of our psyche through psychedelic journeys, we can't unsee that, and that can definitely cause what you're talking about, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has, implications for sex, and like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the sex can change, sometimes it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some interesting stuff there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, and the other thing that occurs to me, that I remember hearing at the MAPS conference in 2023, that Sex and Psychedelics panel, that was so cool. One of the speakers on the panel pointed out that psychedelics and sexual experiences can be altered states.
Right.
And there's a lot of neuroplasticity that it can occur there. So it follows to reason that if we were to combine these things, there could potentially be some big shifts.
Yeah, like this speaks to a little bit for me an interesting point, and it's like how many multitudes we contain,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Me
sexuality
too.
is kind of challenging to our identity as one thing. Similarly, psychedelics do that. I remember one of my more interesting classes in my undergrad was sexual ethics, and we read some really interesting books. Like, what other programs have you read? American Psycho and The Story of O, and a bunch of other weird uh, fiction as part of
Send me
like
that syllabus if
ethics.
you still have it.
Holy, I'll see if I do. I saved a lot of
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah, cool.
It's fascinating, and like this idea that somebody's like a really buttoned down person, like, oh cool, like that's who they are, and then like 20 minutes later, absolute like lunatic animal. And it's like, not saying lunatic's bad. It's just like kind of werewolf inside of us, right? It's like there's like a certain level of our being that can become exposed that way. Same with psychedelics, same with
Yeah,
sex. And it's
for sure.
interesting that they can be gateways together to
For
like
sure.
transcendence, I guess.
For sure. And everything, yes, what you're saying, and it shows us different parts of ourselves. Like one of the ways I conceptualize psychedelic journeys to a friend who's never done more than maybe smoked a tiny bit of marijuana. They were like, well, what is even going on there? And I was like, well, I mean, it's hard for me. It is hard to put into words. But for me personally, and for other people I've known, it's almost like going into, like, if my psyche is like a mansion, like a house, it's like going in, I don't know, I have recurring dreams about going into a strange house that I don't know, and there's like all these like passageways and all these doorways and these rooms that I didn't know about, or maybe it's a house I'm familiar with even, and yet even though I'm quote familiar with it, there's like all these other aspects and all these other rooms, and that's what it feels like to me sometimes, is going into parts of my psyche and shining the light into things I forgot, things I never consciously knew. Um, all kinds of, it's really, really fascinating. Yeah, they're gateways for sure. And if we are open to it, our sexual experiences, either with or without the addition of psychedelics, can be this as well. It's part of it is getting out of our own way around the roles that we feel like we're supposed to play. I think that's part of what you're talking about as well, is like it unleashes and helps people to bring forth different parts of themselves.
Mm. Right. So, in terms of like psychedelics during sex, like I've seen maybe one research trial that's going. Are you familiar with the work of Tommaso Barba?
I'd have to double check. There's something in one of my presentations. Are you talking about the one where they looked at mushrooms and sexual self-efficacy?
I think they started. No, this is a couples study, and I don't know that it's published yet.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I
That
think
might explain.
I was kind of helping him kind of coordinate to get some more like participants,
Oh,
and
cool.
shouldn't be hard, but you know,
Yeah, I'd be surprised sometimes, but yeah.
interesting. But yeah, it's like it's heartening to know that there's actual researchers. I think he's at University College London, I think, and or Imperial, I don't know. And I think there's going to be some really interesting waves from him. Like he's got a really interesting alliance network. I'd recommend him being somebody you should kind of reach out to and learn from a little bit. Like really friendly.
Absolutely. I
I
would
think,
love that.
funnily enough, you just got back from a sex conference, a sex
Yeah.
therapy conference in Italy. He's Italian, so
Yeah.
some
Might have
interesting
even
stuff
been
there.
there for all I know. Yeah.
That's a really good point. There's a chance. Yeah,
Yeah, there is a chance. Yeah, the European Federation of Sexology is super cool interdisciplinary event.
yeah,
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to get to present there 3 times individually, and I was on 2 panels with some colleagues, and it was an amazing experience.
that's excellent.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so like there are people out there actively doing research in like kind of a hyper quantified way. I, for whatever reason, yes, that's helpful. I prefer like the more poetic research, right? Like when you read through like an Esther Perel, you're just like, oh, what a sweetheart who's got so much lived experience and like can really speak to this. Um,
Yeah, that's sort of the way that I tend to skew, and I actually this another thing that I do, this is so random, but you know me, I'm sort of like all these different like facets of my life. I edit PhD dissertations also, so I combine my psychology and my editing and writing skills. Not that I'm writing, but sometimes you do a tiny rewrite for somebody just to help them, clarify something. And I tend to work more with people who are doing qualitative research. That's more like narrative based, like heavy on interviews. Interpersonal interaction between researcher slash clinician and interviewee is key to the process, which also resonates for me from that journalistic background as well. So I'm in a similar direction to you as well, as far as like when it comes to research. I love also hearing what other clinicians are experiencing, like in their therapy room. Like, what is really like
yeah,
Esther Perel? I just reread Mating in Captivity a few weeks ago, and I was like, oh man, this is a classic for a reason.
yeah, so many gems
Mhm.
in there. And
Totally.
so I want to get into like the edgy stuff a little bit and like what I've observed in the space here and there. So
Sure.
like we have the famous case from the San Francisco school that I won't name, where like they were using a lot of kind of like sexual postures here and there as part of their facilitation. Without like all sorts of consent up front before dosing, like it's wildly problematic.
Yes.
I know of some other groups who would mid session actually like at the facilitator would work you towards orgasm mid session. I know, and they had all sorts of reasoning around it, like bioenergetics, Reiki, and stuff,
Hmm.
blah blah blah. And they're
Right.
operating very outside of clinical frame. I'm
Right.
like,
Sounds
that
like
seems like really sketchy, but they're very proud of their results.
it. Mm.
Um, and then there was somebody who is, I think, not too far removed from those people, who
Hmm.
was an underground guide who would actually have sex with their clients
Hmm.
and be like, this is XYZ for your healing. And I knew people that came out of that who were very happy with the result,
Okay.
like really fucking crazy. And I'm like, I'm wildly uncomfortable with that, but I'm gonna like flag that as something I observed. And I'm
Right.
just like,
Right.
I tried to I was on a rampage about that person for a while, and I thankfully didn't call the police, I guess.
Oh
I don't
wow.
know. But anyway, like there's a lot of this stuff happening out there, and I wonder about like where we are today versus where we could be in 100 years with this stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I wonder too, and I feel like a lot of the work that I do and that I see other clinicians and adjacent, sex educators and other people, even for example, pelvic floor physical therapists, like a lot of what we're doing is we're helping people to have language around this. And that's one thing where I feel like the field of psychotherapy has work to do in this country, because if you really look closely, um, sex counseling is not a requirement in most states. It's not required in the curriculum in most counseling programs. And that just really, really blows my mind because I believe that this is a key aspect of human experience. And like you had said earlier, it gets kind of compartmentalized, like, oh yeah, that's complex, we don't go there. And so then you got the other side of it where you have people who are like, oh, hell yeah, we're going to go there. But what's really going on there? And so when people ask me, and not to deny that some of these folks have had results, for sure, I'm with you on that. Like, we don't want to be dismissive around that. So when people ask me about how do you combine sex and psychedelics, I always say very carefully.
Hear that, everybody? Very carefully. There's a lot of wounds very close to the surface that you could really fuck people up.
Yes, you
So
can. And people also ask me, do I sit with people on psychedelics currently? The answer is no, I actually don't. And I think that some people are doing great work in that space. And it really is, and it's a whole nother topic. It's unfortunate about the developments, for example, around MDMA with the FDA and all of that. That's unfortunate. But what I do in my personal practice is I help people either get ready for journeys and or integrate journeys. Sometimes people need to integrate a journey that happened 20 years ago. They need some help still to make sense of it. Sometimes people come into my room and they're like, hey, we did MDMA over the weekend. And I'm like, okay, let's start to work to like integrate this experience that I may or may not have known that they were going to have. Usually don't. And to help people prepare. So that's where it is. And so I remember I listened to one of your other podcasts, one with, who was it? It was another clinician. Was it? I think it might have been Laura May Northrop, maybe?
she's great. Yeah, she talks a lot about like ethics and violations and stuff like that.
Right. And so don't come to me, folks, asking where you can get the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a you problem, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Yeah, but what you're saying, and it is very real, that because a lot of this stuff still lives in the shadows, even within the field of psychotherapy, forget about the mind-altering substances. Even within that field, we still have work to do. There's to up-level our clinical competency as a field around sex and sexuality. I plan to be a part of that at some point by developing educational resources, but that day hasn't come yet.
Yeah. So when you're giving a talk, like what's your preferred way to present about this intersection between like relationship, sex, and psychedelics?
Well, I've learned Canva. So I have some good-looking PowerPoints. I also like to dialogue with the audience, and depending on the venue, like some audiences are all about it and they want to talk about it and share experience and share anecdotes. And I always keep a notebook anytime I give a talk because people always share great ideas, like integration ideas, preparation ideas, and I'll write it down and add it to the next iteration of the presentation. So to me, it's not just, me telling you what's up. It's collaboration. It's a collaborative approach. And so that's how I like to do it. I also like to really use humor because let's face it, not only are there tons of puns in this work, but it's just like to bring a little bit of lightness because we can get really bogged down and really serious about our sex and or our psychedelics. And sometimes like some of my most healing journeys have been where I was laughing to the point that I was a little concerned if that was causing issues in the rest of the container.
Right.
But that's what I needed in that moment, was just to have a sense of like joy and lightness and humor around certain things. So I like to bring the humor when I can.
One of my friends had an experience where I'm pretty sure he was laughing the whole time I was sitting. This is not psychedelics, but breath work. And
Yeah.
the experience was just blissful comedy of him being Godzilla smashing a city. It's
Sounds
like,
amazing.
I'll take that. I'll order that one twice. Like, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, and
fascinating.
sometimes that's what our system needs.
What do you think it is about um, the clinical perspective that makes us not want to bring humor sometimes?
Mm.
Like everything's so serious. It's like, like everything's life or death, or I don't know. There's room for a lot
Yeah.
of humor here in everything medical and everything psychedelic.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel that sometimes I mean, I'm kind of like, well, you're asking the wrong person because I always bring the humor. But I think it's all about dosage. And I feel like that some people hold back on that level because they are afraid that they will somehow dishonor the container and or the process by being overly humorous. And that could come from either side. It could come from practitioners. It could come from people who are journeying. Um, yeah, that I feel like that might be part of it. I've been very blessed in my own work that the containers I've been a part of, the humor has been actually very welcome. So
Good.
that's a blessing.
Love that. Yeah, yeah, I think there's something about that like sacredness of the container and they don't want to blow it, but ignoring if you're saying one thing's sacred and humor isn't, then I think we need to look at that.
Yeah, I
Um,
think we need to look at all of the things that we'd rather not look at.
right. So like let's talk about like what would, like, say you were doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy right now, like MDMA work with somebody. Say you were not, you aren't doing it now,
Yeah,
like,
let's just
and
do a thought experiment.
they had some, XYZ sexual issue. Like, how in your ideal world are you prepping them to say, okay, this is what we're going to be working on when you're in there, or do you let it come through as an emergent thing if it does, or how would you want to attack this?
Both and. Do you
Hmm.
have a specific area and or intention that you would like to work with in this journey? And let's also be open to whatever needs to emerge emerging. It may or may not be tracking with the intention that we go into with it. But no matter what happens, I always want to encourage as best we can to ask ourselves, or if we're guiding someone, to just be in that space of compassionate, curious inquiry. What is the emerging energy trying to tell us?
Right.
What's the message there? Because, for example, I know someone who almost every time they do any type of psychedelic, a huge energy of fear comes up. It really emerges for them. They're brave, they keep doing the work. And so every single time they go in and it emerges, this is a strong person, okay? Strong, sensitive person who's done a lot of work. So they have a foundation, okay? I just want to make that clear. They sit with that fear and they let it talk to them and they let it, and every single time, instead of turning away from it, that's the tendency sometimes when the thing comes up that we're like, oh my God, there it is. There's that human tendency to turn away and self-reject and self-abandon that a lot of us live with. And that's where a lot of times the roots of the trauma actually lie, is having felt abandoned, rejected, unseen, having felt turned away from, misattuned to, and then we inflict that back on ourselves unwittingly, right? So this person does the opposite. They sit with it, they dialogue with it, they allow themselves to feel it. And every single time they learn something with it and they have a deeper understanding and a deeper compassion for themselves through that work.
Well, that's beautiful. Um, and that's important. And then, like, ideally, if like you have a couple, and they have sex issues, like how would that look with like psychedelics being part of that process? Like ideally, maybe with what we know today or what you know today, like what's kind of like an ideal scenario?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Are we talking about somebody who I might be working with in the room directly, theoretically, or are we talking about more of like maybe sort of like just guiding them through the journey before and after the fact. You know what I mean? Like, what, when you say that, what scenario are you envisioning?
So like clinical relationship,
Right.
doing like couples therapy, but like around their sexual issues, and then like there's room for psychedelic assisted therapy to be involved, and or they're very used to using this stuff and they want to like do their own, but like,
Right.
not
So
implicating the
again, I feel
clinician.
like at the risk of sounding a little bit repetitive, I feel like it's to the best of our ability is in whatever context we're doing this in, trying to be as present as possible. So that's what I would really encourage for them, is to try to be as present with each other and with themselves as possible and seeing what emerges. And I feel that, when we're doing the psychedelic work, we have opportunities to have more expansive experiences of ourselves and others. There's, the idea of releasing perfectionism, because sex works differently if you choose to engage with it. A lot of times it physically and emotionally and energetically actually works different when you're using a mind-altering substance in an altered state of consciousness. But it also, for a lot of people, really opens up this gateway where they can really experience themselves and each other in ways that they haven't. So I feel like it also shows us, and I would be very mindful of this as a therapist, where is this person potentially hiding from themselves? Where are they doing protective compartmentalization? Because a lot of times, as we know, psychedelics will blow the lid off of that. So I haven't said it in quite these words, but I'm very mindful around the creation of the container itself.
Yeah.
And trying to keep that as safe as possible.
Right.
So even if we're processing, they did something, just to say for an example, they went and did some journey on their own over the weekend. Like when they come back into the therapy room a few days later, I would do the best I could to keep that container feeling as safe as possible. We might even have to like go over a couple of agreements just to make sure that they feel okay.
Right.
To share.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, was a big part of like my ongoing education, teaching yoga, which I still do a little bit. The joke I make is that teaching yoga is kind of like being in the mafia. Like just when you think you're out, you get called back in for another job. But that was a big part of my ongoing education and teaching yoga, is like how to be trauma informed, how to create a container that feels reasonably safe. Because not every container is going to feel safe to every person, but doing the best we can to do that and to co-create.
Right.
Get their input.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. What helps them to feel safe in this container? What helps them to feel safe relationally? And how can we work to co-create that?
Mm-hmm.
While also being mindful of the defense mechanisms that might be saying, hey, in order to feel safe, like, I only see my partner once a week. Well, that might not actually be a working model, depending on how their partner feels about that. That might feel very unsafe to the other person. So then the complexity starts to layer in.
Right. Like starting with safety is really interesting. The feeling of safety. I think it's really important. And, I think this is, it seems like we're detangling just yet another part of the human psyche, which doesn't, as far as we got into this conversation, doesn't feel all that unique relative to the other parts of psyche and like human life. It's just like, oh, look, just yet another thing.
It's kind of a joke, right? Because we make this
Yeah.
big deal about sex in this culture. I know other cultures are more relaxed and, pleasure and educationally oriented around it. But in our culture, in our society, we make a big deal out of it. But then it's kind of like, oh, wow, this is just another normal aspect of human existence that also, I think, can be a connection to our divinity. but I think everything can.
Right. Um, that's interesting. So, like, who, who's like a major influence on you in this is kind of like sex therapy world, like beyond Esther Perel?
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I actually would say that I'm like, oh, I'm not, I don't know if I'm allowed to say their names, but I'll say one person, and then I'll decide if I want to. So my there's a woman named Tammy Nelson who does really great work in this field. I think I put a note to myself. Hold on a second. The Integrative Sex Therapy Institute is her organization. So that I have some coursework that I've been doing through Tammy Nelson that I really like her approach. And I also feel
She's
extremely
got
lucky.
in her acronym, she has an STI, for what it's
I
worth.
told you,
All right,
full of puns.
keep going. Keep going.
Full of puns. You just got to either lean into
Yeah.
it or pull back. I tend to lean into it. I was like,
I couldn't
oh,
stop.
couldn't stop, can't stop, won't stop. Nope.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Cool.
So Tammy Nelson is a great resource. There was a professor of mine in grad school, Corrine Haim, is amazing. She's done a lot of work around kink and maybe what we might call erotic marginalization. But erotic marginalization is actually more of the terminology that one of my mentors / supervisors, Robin Flores, delves into. She just did an entire doctorate on that, Dr. Robin Flores. And then another person who I'm professionally associated with is a really great, I think she's an LMFT, Colorado-based. Her name is Melissa Raditz. So more focused on couples relational therapy, but definitely we get into some really interesting and productive conversations about how to work with the sex piece. And she's been a great mentor as well. So, and there are a lot, but those are some of the ones who maybe aren't as famous out in the mainstream culture. There's all the books, I don't know, how do we say it? Nagoski, Emily, her books. There's also, gosh, I'm trying to think who else. There's some other people. Of course, I feel like it's the Oscars, and I'm like forgetting like half the names.
You're good. I only needed one.
Yeah.
but,
So
but you
those are
said
some
a
good
few.
starting points. Yeah.
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 And then you suggested I check out this book Polysecure, which I thought was like
Yes.
how did that not win a Pulitzer? Was kind of like my reaction at the end of it. I'm like, how is this not for everybody?
Jessica
I'm not
Mm-hmm.
poly, but I'm like, this is wildly relevant to monogamous relationships and
Some of the
like,
absolute best explanation of attachment in relationships that applies exactly. It's relevant to all relational structures, I think. Yeah.
I think what happens is like poly makes it so amplified for
Right.
people that we're seeing it in like a really interesting granular fashion where we can work on it because it's like, it's not like life or death in the same way like monogamy feels like it could be, which is an interesting transition. So in the psychedelic space, polyamory seems to be on the rise. And like I don't know the cause, like I don't really particularly understand it, but
Mhm.
like I'm sensitive to it, and this is how people are orienting, and it's like best I can frame it as is like a sexual orientation that's under explored and under misunderstood. And like so my question is around like, okay, so somebody's engaging with psychedelics, they start getting curious, but like there's a lot of potential risk there. Like how do you how would you prepare a client? So say they 20 ayahuasca sessions in over 4 years, and all of
Mm-hmm.
a sudden like this is a thing that they want to explore. How would you suggest they try to stay safe in that
How
for
they stay
themselves?
safe within
For themselves.
themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, not
So
like
I
kidnapping or anything, but yeah.
yeah. So I think part of the reason, just to back up a tiny bit, that you might be seeing this is because as we know that psychedelics like cause us to like really question a lot of things, assumptions.
Everything. Yeah.
Yeah, it causes us to really deeply question. So I think what you're seeing is people questioning and interrogating relational structures, and that our society has told us are this is the way it's supposed to be. And people are just like, well, is it though? Does that apply to me and to my situation, for example? Like, people are asking themselves these questions. Is it an orientation or a lifestyle choice? They get into that. She talks about that in Polysecure, that people come at it from different angles. I would say one of the biggest pieces of guidance that I could give to any client around this or almost any topic is, to the degree possible, be as honest with yourself as you can. Because we bullshit ourselves a lot. Maybe not every single human on this earth does that, but I mean, and I think that is a big part of my job as a clinician, is to help people to maybe stop bullshitting themselves. So that's probably my biggest piece of guidance, and also to stay attuned and aware of their core values. Then those can change, and that's okay. That's developmentally normal for values to change over time for some folks. To stay extremely honest and aware of core values, and is the life that they're living and creating and co-creating, is it in alignment enough with their core values or not? And if it's not, then there's work to do there. There's work to do there, and and that's the safety piece within self, like the safety piece relationally. Those things can apply there as well. Be as honest with yourselves, with each other as possible. Study how to communicate in ways that are trauma-informed. Regulate your nervous systems together and alone. So I think all of that applies.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. And
yeah, sure.
Yeah, the question everything part. I somehow forget about that sometimes. but the Tim Leary line, TFYQA, think for yourself and question authority, I think is like really big here. And that's in part what we're still doing with like questions even like that.
Yeah, that resonates for me. I mean, even just my own background of growing up grew up in Texas, like kind of like sort of like Bible Belt vibes.
Nice.
And then, having an immigrant father from an Islamic culture that he still doesn't necessarily subscribe to a lot of that. He doesn't subscribe to the religiosity at all. My father is the first person who ever talked to me about Buddhism. And the concept of God is too big for one religion. Like, that's something my dad said to me when I was like 12, and I was like, whoa. But growing up, but nonetheless, even though my dad is extremely open-minded and a deep thinker and loves to watch Alan Watts videos on YouTube and talk to me about them, nonetheless, there is still the cultural component of growing up in the Bible Belt and growing up with a father from a different culture that has a very distinct way of looking at sex, sexuality, and relationships. And so a lot of my own process has been my own questioning and my own deconditioning. And I want to make that really clear that it is ongoing work. So one of the practitioners that you were talking to on a previous episode said that clinicians and guides, and we all need to be doing our own work. And I fully believe in that.
Yeah. And I want to point here that it's not necessarily the case that doing your work is drinking ayahuasca every week or every month or every year. It's could just be going to therapy and taking care of your body.
Yes.
Getting 5 surgeries a year if that's what your doctors tell you need to do to be well. And then
you're talking about yourself there?
Maybe. But yeah, it's it's fascinating. Like it shows up very individually in very individual ways, and you don't know what's going on for the others.
Mm-mm.
So
No, and I mean, trust me, I know a lot more about what's going on with people than a lot of people do because people tell me stuff, but ultimately we don't always know. Like we can't really know. I mean, we can do the best we can to try to understand and intuit and all of that, and ask, inquire lovingly. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes our work is not big and dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's just getting 10,000 steps a day, going out and breathing in fresh air for a few minutes if we have access to fresh air, depending on where we are. It doesn't, and that's the other thing that I like to really emphasize is that even though I talk about this stuff and it's kind of exciting and sexy and esoteric and this, that, and the other, it's actually kind of boring and mundane too, because what really helps these results to even happen in the first place and to integrate well is actually really boring basics done over and over and over again for months and years that compound on each other.
Right.
Just like you're not going to get like super healthy and fit from going to the gym once. You're not going to heal every part of your psyche by taking one big journey. You might have some big moves, but it's ultimately what you do in day-to-day life, especially after the journey, that is going to help you, is going to help people. Yeah, and we see that sometimes. We see people who have big journeys and then things don't really change for them. And I think that sometimes that's because the boring, mundane basics maybe don't get covered.
Right.
And no
Yeah.
judgment, nothing but compassion there, because it can be a real trip, quite literally, to have a big experience like that, and then to, like you said earlier, get kind of plopped back into your day-to-day. It can be big.
Yeah.
Hard. It can be hard.
So let's end it on like a really weird conversation.
Oh
So
yeah, let's do it.
where's one of the weirdest places on earth with lots of strange sex and strange drugs? And it's Burning Man. You could say Las Vegas, but
Mm.
Burning Man, right? And it's like everybody's questioning everything. Everybody's, there's
Yeah.
there's 20 camps where you can go get sex education like all day long. And
Yeah, I know some
then
people who are involved in that for sure.
right, like I
Mhm.
for whatever reason, when I was living in Boulder, stayed far away, but I knew of plenty of these folks who were doing all
Oh
sorts of
yeah.
interesting stuff. And I'm like,
Yeah, you can't swing a dead cat and not hit some of these. As my
people
mother used to say.
swing a dead cat. That's an amazing line.
Yeah, it really
Um,
is. And I love cats, so I kind of feel both sad and like humorous when I say that. But yeah.
so, like, it's a really interesting experiment, like this Burning Man thing. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of psychedelics going down. There's a lot of this
Oh yeah,
sex ed and experiential stuff going on. Like,
sure.
I was looking at the calendar events for one of these camps the other day, and I was like,
Hmm.
what the fuck is happening? Like, like go girl, like do it, but like
Yeah.
what on earth is happening?
Mm.
Like relative to my weird kind of rural existence here in Colorado. I'm like, that's wild shit. And I'm like, how what are the ways in which like a relatively normal person with plenty of robust repression, etc., stuff they haven't worked on yet, like what are the ways in which that's interesting and potentially like problematic, like potentially like challenging in a good way for them and potentially like problematic to be exposed to that kind of like optionality, or how do you, when I tell this story, like what do you have for a reaction to it?
Yeah, I just have so much curiosity because I feel like I've actually never, and this is going to either endear me or turn certain people off. I really don't give a shit. Like I've never been to Burning Man, and I'm so 50-50 as to whether that's a thing, that if that resonates for me. Parts of it absolutely resonate. Maybe kind of what it's become in the past few like years maybe don't resonate quite as much for me. That's another conversation for another day. But about environmentalism, sustainability, privilege, all of that. Um, what would I say? I would say it's funny. My late mother used to say something that I used to just like roll my eyes and just like, yeah, right, mom, whatever. But what she used to say is that little things mean a lot. And so I would say if somebody wants to start to explore in that direction, that it is okay to take small steps and to titrate. And that if you feel overwhelmed, that it's okay to ease out of those situations, to honor your capacity. There's no heroism in blowing through your own capacity. That was actually a message I got in one of my own journeys. It's like, hey, Bria, just because you have a massive capacity to hold energetically for others doesn't mean that you always need to. It's actually okay to let them do their own work. And it's actually okay to turn some of your capacity and your energetic abilities back on yourself in a loving way. So I would say honor capacity while being curious.
Mm, mm. Yeah, because I could relate to like hard charging, all sorts of weird new experiences, and then your term of art in skiing is over the tips of your skis. So you're just like about to do crazy amount of somersaults, but you're just so like loaded with stuff, and you didn't take like a moment to take a break to like consolidate and like work with it, sit with it for a little while, and like
Yeah, it sounds
you crash and
literally
fucking burn.
ungrounded.
Yeah,
Sounds ungrounded. It sounds like, I think, a lot of things, like dosage is important.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And what might be a
And
microdose to one person might be a macrodose to somebody else.
this is a really hard but good conversation because some people I talk to, like if they have the smallest dose of something by my standards, like they're having a really, really challenging time. I had a friend recently who like probably would get hospitalized if she had MDMA in her body. Just all
Wow.
sorts of neurological stuff going on. Had some like accidentally hit topically and had a lovely time. And it's like the smallest amount, just like on the skin, and wiped it off very quickly. And I was
Wow.
like, oh, that's interesting. So like a
Mhm.
milligram or sub milligram
Mhm.
dose topically
Yeah.
absorbed had that big of an impact. Wild.
Yeah, and
So
we can
we don't
become
know.
more sensitive or more or less sensitive over time.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
something to be aware of too. Not where was I last time? Where am I now? It's
Right.
hard to know sometimes.
Right. So, um, anything else that we want to really make sure people understand about this topic before
Mhm.
we roll here?
Yeah, let me just check in with myself here real quick and see if there's anything else. I feel like we really covered a lot. I feel like there's so much more that we could totally do more if we wanted to at some point down the line. I'm so open to that. Um, Let me see. I'm going to say that there's a couple of things. Is that instead of just sometimes in certain contexts, I think it could be useful to reframe
Yes.
positive versus negative experience. I think sometimes a helpful reframe can be comfortable versus uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And to combine curiosity, especially if something is uncomfortable, like get curious with what's the fear, what's the concern, what's under that. Um, a colleague of
Yeah.
mine is big on that question. What's the fear? Hi, Dave. And what's under the fear?
Right.
So I think that's important. And yeah, any thoughts on that?
I like it. What came up for me was like the first time I sat down in therapy, this very old man was like, "Oh, anger. That's interesting. Anger is usually what comes right before fear. It's like
Hmm.
it's like a defense against fear." Um, and that's interesting. It's like, anger, fear behind fear. And like that's pretty clever. I like that.
Yeah, it is. And then the other thing that occurs to me as you say that is the importance, and we touched on this earlier, of unfelt feelings. So I know, for example, I know a lot of women who I've never seen them angry. I've never seen them pissed off. And it's like, ooh,
What do you
what
think that is?
is, yeah, I think that, well, I mean, I think, was it Freud who said that anger unexpressed gets turned in on yourself and becomes depression?
That's
That may or may not
interesting.
be a
I like
insane.
that. I like that
Yeah,
dynamic.
so
Yeah.
I think that that's part of it. So I feel like no matter, and that's just an example. There are many ways. There are many. If there's unfelt feelings, I think that's important to look at. And my a mentor of mine, this is one of the first people who started to help me become personally aware of like my erotic power and to start getting into that space of healing from that more feminine lens, is a woman named Mama Gina. So that's definitely somebody worth looking up. And I'm sure she probably still talks about this, about that there's like if our emotional range is like a keyboard, a lot of us are only playing like middle C over and over and over again when there are 8 octaves of range. And so if we can't feel our depths, guess what else we can't feel? We can't feel our joy and ecstasy. And there's a lot of spaces in between too. So to really just notice our space where we're blanked out, unfeeling, numb. What are we not feeling?
Right. Yeah.
And
That's
what
interesting.
information is there that from what we're not feeling, and to offer ourselves compassion and honesty when we look at that stuff.
Right.
There's a reason a lot of people won't do this work. I understand. It's difficult sometimes.
Yeah. Um, well, I love all of this. And Mama Gina, I'll be looking her up.
Yeah, she's cool.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Bria, where can people find you online?
Thank you for asking. So I have a website called embodywithbria.com, BRIA. And I actually recently just put a share your story link on the nav bar on that website. So if anybody wants to anonymously or share who they are, share a story about their experience with sex and psychedelics, I am actually collecting some narratives that I might anonymously, I'm not going to like throw anybody under the bus, put anybody on blast, potentially share in future presentations so that we can start to have more just examples and ideas of how this has played out for people. Yeah, so that's one avenue. I'm on Instagram is at Bria Tavakoli. That'll be in the show notes. The name is not the easiest to spell, lots of vowels in there. And yeah, just in the future, I do have a contact page. You can also DM me on Instagram to be on the interest list, because I am developing some different programming. And I know we've talked about maybe we'll do some collabs ourselves at some point, and I hope we do. And so I'm developing a masterclass, or actually I'm just reconfiguring a masterclass I've been teaching in person to have an online format about how ideas and safety practices and considerations, and for exploring the combination of sex and psychedelics. I've presented that in several different venues, conferences, educational contexts. And then I'm planning to create an online course, like a more in-depth look at that. And so yeah, if any of that sounds at all of interest to anybody, embodywithbria.com or Bria Tavakoli on Instagram are the places to find me currently.
Love it. Bria,
Yeah.
thank you so much, and I can't wait to do more with you. It's going to be exciting.
Likewise. It's always great to connect with you all. You all are doing such cool stuff. So thank you.
Absolutely. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.